Quick shout out to our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Surfshark. You might just think of him as a narcissist, but without his arrogance, he wouldn't be Satoru Gojo. It takes a certain mentality to reach that level. You have to be a little bit crazy if you want to be the strongest. Being the best is something that's bigger than just yourself. When he was alive, Gojo wasn't an exception. Most notably against Toji Zenin, he might have nearly lost his life, but he definitely lost his mind. He begins rambling manically. Even Toji's questioning if Gojo's high out of his mind. Despite brutally unaliving Riko, it's not even close to what drives Gojo to end Toji's life. Smiling above the clouds, it's not about revenge. He's got no empathy towards Riko's death, and he actually doesn't really seem to care all that much. Gojo's not angry for anything that's already happened. He's just doing what feels right. It's one of the most iconic moments in Jujutsu Kaisen, but at its core, it's almost disturbing when you start to break it down. It's just one example of the many times that people have come to question Satoru Gojo's sanity. He's clearly gone off the edge, and definitely not just once. There's clearly something wrong with him. He's definitely more than one type of crazy. We'll need to evaluate Gojo psychologically, understanding his behavior within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. Today, we're going to be finding out if Satoru Gojo is truly a psychopath. When you're reading Jujutsu Kaisen online, these days, the internet just really isn't the safest place to be surfing, but this video's sponsor, Surfshark, has you covered. My favorite part about Surfshark VPN is accessing content from almost anywhere on the planet. With just a couple clicks, change your virtual location to thousands of servers across 100 different countries. Nowadays, there's just so many places to watch your favorites. Just think about how many websites you're clicking on every day. Surfshark VPN also has one of the best ways to secure your data across all those websites. Keeping your IP address hidden is crucial for online privacy. Your browsing history stays anonymous, making sure that your identity stays protected. You can hide from search engines and stay safe from breaches. Make sure to download Surfshark VPN. Surfshark also has one of the best antivirus features that I've ever seen. Nothing gets through once defended with Surfshark's robust scanners that check files in real time during any type of install, download, or even just usage alone. It's lightweight security too, meaning that it won't hog your CPU or RAM or even slow down your device at all while making sure that you're gonna have 24/7 malware protection. Surfshark's clean web feature, which I personally use every single day, blocks ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts, protecting your privacy and safety every single time you click on any website. Normally, it's hard to commit your time, money, and patience to trying new products, especially online. But you don't have to worry, because with Surfshark VPN, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. You're also going to get an extra 4 months for literally free just by using the code on screen, so definitely make sure to take advantage. Use the link in the description, and with just a couple clicks, you can keep your device virus-free. Obviously, there isn't one definition for being a psychopath, and you should definitely do your own research. Instead of giving a complete breakdown of psychopathy, we're going to be using the PCLR. It's basically the psychopathy checklist, our own psychological test used to evaluate the presence of psychopathy in anybody's mind. This checklist is considered the standardized assessment tool, meaning that it's been carefully designed and validated through rigorous scientific research. It's used both clinically across the world and within the American criminal justice system. If you're really interested, I'll be leaving some research that backs the PCLR's validity on screen. Using the PCLR is almost like any other checklist you're gonna find. In total, there's 14 questions, each of them relating to the traits of your typical psychopaths. Some questions on the PCLR were removed just for the sake of this video not being an hour long, and considering some of these missing questions don't at all pertain to Gojo and are pretty obvious, I personally didn't find any reason to include them. We'll answer each question with either 0, 1, or 2. 0 means that Gojo doesn't indicate any signs of these traits, not one bit. 1 means that this trait kind of applied, and Gojo only has it to some extent, and 2 just means that you can clearly identify this trait within Gojo. It's very present within his character. Question number 1. Glibness and superficial charm. Does Satoru Gojo uses charm to escape a difficult or uncomfortable situation? Individuals with this trait are typically smooth talkers who can seem insincere. They can be very deceiving. Some criminal psychopaths became notorious for using their charm and charisma to lure victims and manipulate others. There's many who appear confident, articulated, and friendly to gain the trust of others around them. Obviously, being confident and articulated doesn't inherently mean that you have psychopathic traits. This charm being superficial is the key word. It's forced and maybe even synthetic. It's usually a mask behind true intentions or lacking genuine empathy and emotional connection. Jordan Belfort from The Wolf of Wall Street is a very good example. He used his charm and persuasive skills to engage in fraudulent stock market activities. Jordan used his wealth and superficial success to gain the trust of others around him while never having genuine empathy or an emotional connection to his victims. It's hard to say that Satoru Gojo falls into this category, but it's definitely not very clear-cut. One of his most iconic quotes is surrounding the idea of him being the quote-unquote quote-unquote strongest. Depending on the context, this could be Gojo's way of charming who he's speaking to with superficial qualities. This completely depends on why Gojo feels the need to express himself being the strongest. However, for Satoru Gojo, I don't think he falls under this category. He really doesn't express himself being strong that often. It's really dragged out throughout the fandom, especially if you're trying to compare Gojo to being a psychopath. Others claim Gojo's superiority, but never really himself. It's mostly others who compare Gojo's strength. The two times that Gojo does call himself the strongest are either when he's talking to himself or when he's talking to Megumi. But when he's talking to Megumi, he flat out says to not worry because he's the strongest. He's not trying to be deceitful or insincere or manipulative. Gojo just wanted to reassure Megumi. Intentionality is very important for every question going forward on the PCLR. It can definitely make or break a score. Gojo never projects his charm in the way that other psychopaths would. He gets a 0. Next question. Grandiose sense of self-worth. Does Satoru Gojo display an exaggerated sense of self-importance or superiority? Individuals with this trait often see themselves as inherently better or more important than others, giving them a sense of entitlement, leading to that feeling of superiority. Kanye West is a great real-world example. He often claims himself as a genius and goes as far to say that he's the greatest of all time.
I am the #1 most impactful artist of our generation. I am Shakespeare in the flesh, Walt Disney.
It doesn't need much explaining to find Gojo within this category. Having a high sense of self basically defines Satoru Gojo. When he decided himself that he stands alone as the honored one, Gege Akutami, the mangaka and author of Jujutsu Kaisen, he says himself that this statement was projected through arrogance. It's clearly demonstrating that inflated ego of the self-proclaimed strongest. Megumi said before that weak sorcerers don't have their own sense of self. Satoru Gojo is definitely not an exception. His massive sense of self doesn't need much explaining. Both his actions and dialogue all throughout the story exemplify this clearly. I'm giving Gojo an obvious 2. This is a very strongly present trait within his character. The third question on the PCLR. Need for stimulation or proneness to boredom. Does Satoru Gojo exhibit a need for stimulation or a tendency to become bored easily? Many who score high on this trait often engage in risk or thrill-seeking behavior, specifically to relieve boredom. Being bored easily doesn't mean that you have psychopathic traits. This question on the PCLR is mostly referring to people who relieve boredom by doing those dangerous or even thrill-seeking activities. To these individuals, this method of relieving boredom feels more like a necessity. It's hard to say that Gojo falls into this category, but it's also not very clear-cut. He definitely enjoys fighting. He's one of the clearest examples in the series. When Gojo's mind floods with the idea that he might actually lose, he thinks back to Toji Zenin. That's the last time anybody put him on the edge. Weirdly enough, when thinking back to a time that he literally almost died, he just begins smiling. Just as signs of defeat show, there's also a rush that's more intense for Gojo than even the idea of losing. Our narrator says that it's satisfaction, but finding satisfaction in dangerous activities isn't the question on the PCLR. Just enjoying fighting doesn't mean that you're a psychopath. Kashimo Hajime would be a better example. He's actively searching for a combatant to satisfy his boredom. It's different from Satoru Gojo. He's definitely bored without fighting strong opponents. However, he never acted of pure boredom when deciding to engage in dangerous activities. Gojo usually has another motivation aside from winning or chasing his own adrenaline. Engaging in dangerous behavior isn't a necessity for Gojo like most other psychopaths. He's gonna be scored a 0. The fourth question on the PCLR. Pathological lying. Does Satoru Gojo engage in pathological lying or deception? Individuals who score high on this question are obviously dishonest, often deceiving others through fabricating stories or manipulating information to achieve their own goals or maintain their own image. It's pretty clear cut, but Gojo is not one of these individuals. There's a difference between lying and being genuinely wrong. Claiming that he can win against Sukuna then going on to lose isn't an example of lying. Intention behind these statements are very important. Proving that an individual lied also requires providing information that they knew that their statement was false in the first place. Being wrong doesn't necessarily make you a liar. Satoru Gojo gets another 0. Question number 5. Conning and manipulativeness. Does Satoru Gojo engage in conning and manipulative behavior? Individuals who score highly on this trait may be skilled at exploiting others, often deceiving others for their own personal gain to achieve their own objectives. This question particularly can encompass traits that we've already evaluated, like using superficial charm or pathological lying to achieve the same end goal. It can sound like we're asking the same question twice, but there's a difference in each of these questions. You'll find each of them on the PCLR for a different reason. Psychopathic superficial charm emphasizes the insincerity on the surface level. It's not really layered or deep-rooted and more outright visible. Pathological lying focuses more on the frequency of the dishonesty and how often someone can be untruthful. This question is more about manipulativeness, specifically the tendency to manipulate and exploit others for personal gain. It's more about being calculated rather than charmful or just outright lying. It's another category that Gojo just doesn't really fall under. It at least not like other psychopaths. However, there is one instance that does make me question Satoru Gojo's manipulativeness, and it's way back in Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 0 during the night parade of 100 demons. Gojo sends both Panda and Inumaki back to Kyoto. Neither Inumaki or Panda were fit to deal with a special grade like Geto, but Gojo knew that and sent them anyways. Later on after the night parade, Geto says that Gojo sent Panda and Inumaki knowing that Geto would defeat them in the end, and he wanted them to get beaten down so that way they can trigger Yuta's growth. And Gojo knew that Geto wouldn't just exercise a young sorcerer without reason. Regardless, that last fact doesn't really make this any less manipulative. This scenario would likely grant Gojo 1 point on the PCLR. While his behavior may not be as extreme as other psychopaths, this is deliberate manipulation of others for personal gain. Question number 6 on the PCLR, shallow effect. Is Satoru Gojo emotionally empty? Psychopaths with this trait may appear emotionally detached, superficial, or indifferent to the feelings of others. They may have a difficulty experiencing or even expressing genuine emotion. Specifically, these emotions are more like empathy and remorse. These individuals don't really have any emotional depth or range in expression or reactions. Patrick Bateman from American Psycho is a very good example. He clearly has the traits of being someone who's emotionally shallow. Patrick Bateman has a great outward appearance. He seems very happy, successful, and fulfilled to just about anybody who he meets in the city. However, Bateman uses this facade to hide his own lack of genuine emotions and overall empathy for his victims. Even during extremely violent situations, he maintains no emotional reaction. Bateman's reactions are often detached and don't really have any authentic emotion, reflecting how emotionally shallow he's become. During moments where others might be filled with emotion, these psychopaths don't really feel just about anything. It's not just about missing the feeling of empathy, but other emotions like happiness and even sadness that aren't present within these emotionally empty individuals. I'm focused on really explaining this question clearly since it's one of the most important and crucial aspects to why many call Gojo a psychopath. In short, I don't think Satoru Gojo is emotionally empty, but there's more than a few reasons why this might be the most complicated question for Gojo on the PCLR. Many are quick to point out Gojo's visit to the Star Plasma religious group during Hidden Inventory. It's the original example for him having psychopathic tendencies. After his second round against Toji Zenin, while carrying Riko through the Time Vessel Association hideout, Suguru Geto finds him unlike his normal self. He asked if that's even Gojo before realizing that something clearly shifted about his personality, because something definitely just changed against Toji. During that second round, Gojo mentions a few things that we shouldn't just ignore when trying to evaluate him psychologically. More than one comment revealed more about Gojo's mindset than ever before just during that one fight alone. He obviously claims himself as the honored one who throughout both heaven and earth stood alone. While Gojo's arguably dissociating while hyping up his own god complex, that's not really what's important when answering number 6 on the PCLR. Just before this statement, he describes how exactly emotionally shallow Gojo might seem. He apologized to Riko, but not exactly for what you would expect. Gojo's sorry that he's not upset about her death at all. No feeling of revenge against Toji Zenin motivated him to come back for another fight. He doesn't feel angry or vengeful about it whatsoever. In that moment, he says that everything felt right. That's when he became the honored one. Most people would feel anger or even crave vengeance because of their deep emotional engagement with that person. Even arguing that Gojo didn't care much about Riko doesn't explain why he didn't feel empathetic about what happened. He claims that he's sorry for not being moved by her death emotionally, almost like Gojo himself is aware of the present lack of emotion. Apologizing isn't always an admission of guilt. Context and the speaker's intent is very important between drawing the line for what could be displayed as a personal regret or empathy. Apologizing isn't always an admission of guilt. Saying sorry for the loss of somebody close to somebody else isn't a murder confession, and that's just another example of conveying empathy. However, mentioning that you're sorry when getting pulled over for speeding, that can be a sign of responsibility or acceptance of the blame. Considering the context, this is Gojo reflecting and realizing that his reaction is different than what others might be considered normal. He's expressing regret that he doesn't feel these emotions. This entire scene is Gojo's self-reflection. He's recognizing himself and analyzing exactly what he's become. He's checking the stock of his own character, almost like Gojo's doing his own personal inventory check. Chapter 75 takes place during an arc where Gojo realizes himself as the honored one. It's an arc that's called Hidden Inventory. Its name represents the new person that he became during the overhaul and evaluation of the stock of his character. Finding himself and his values was definitely one of the themes behind this arc. This scene is Gojo reflecting on himself and his own emotions, not the feelings relating to others around him. This shouldn't be taken as an apology out of empathy. It's his own self-realization of a regrettable lack of emotional connection. Satoru Gojo is just sorry that he doesn't really care. It's very emotionally shallow. He then goes on asking Geto about one of the most truly monstrous ideas that's still sitting in the back of his mind. In complete nonchalance, he asks Geto for his opinion on exercising an entire hall of non-sorcerers just for simply being part of the religious group. None of these guys are in charge. These people are just followers of the faith. Obviously, they had nothing to do in what happened to Riko, but that's not why Gojo's asking. He doesn't really care about what happened to Riko. Gojo didn't feel vengeful towards Toji whatsoever, and definitely doesn't have anger for these random random followers. Regardless, Gojo still continues to contemplate the idea of exercising an entire group of civilians. Going through with this idea, he said he wouldn't even feel a thing about it. Nothing about this sounds normal. However, it's important to realize the purpose of each question on the PCLR. We're assessing traits within each question. Consistent behavior is very important. What we're witnessing from Gojo isn't exactly accurate to his overall character, and it's more of a state of mind than an actual trait. The difference between a trait and state is that traits are much more stable and enduring characteristics that describe a consistent pattern of behavior. States, they're much more influenced by the environment and context, and they're also open to frequent change. If we want to classify Gojo in a state of mind that may have psychopathic traits, that's far more accurate. It's far more reasonable to claim that this version of Gojo can seem emotionally shallow as opposed to it being a trait that's generally applied to his character overall. It's also important to consider that at this point in Gojo's life, he's not even an adult yet. We shouldn't just assume that Gojo hadn't changed certain traits of his character when it's entirely reasonable given how much time has already passed. Down in Shibuya's B5, there's a perfect example. Gojo is clearly a lot different since that time. Gojo is visibly distraught and concerned with the death of non-sorcerers, even if he's not the one that's ending their lives himself. While he's willing to let some innocent civilians perish, there's clearly a limit. When reaching that limit, Gojo clearly grows more and more uncomfortable with the situation, not nearly as nonchalant and emotionally detached as before. Either Gojo had gone through some change at this point, or we can just attribute this to his current state of mind at the time when he fought Toji. Regardless, it shouldn't speak to characterizing the traits of Gojo from the modern era. When Gojo is actually an adult, his emotional emptiness is different from your typical psychopaths. Being emotionally shallow doesn't just refer to lacking in one emotion specifically. It's a broad range of various emotions. Gojo not feeling empathetic, remorseful, or sad doesn't inherently mean that he's emotionally empty. He also clearly feels other emotions too. He's capable of being happy, satisfied, concerned, and even regretful. Maybe not empathetic to everyone and anyone who he finds in a tragic situation, but he's definitely not emotionally empty. I'm scoring Satoru Gojo a 0 on this question. Moving on to question number 7, callousness or lack of remorse or guilt. Does Satoru Gojo lack remorse or even guilt for his actions? Individuals with this trait, obviously lack remorse or guilt for their actions, but especially actions that have caused harm to others. Heath Ledger's Joker from The Dark Knight is a pretty good example. He doesn't think twice about orchestrating chaos and violence throughout Gotham City. Joker doesn't have any regard for the suffering of innocent people, even during pure anarchy. He's driven to cause mayhem in order to challenge Batman and not by any emotional connection or concern with others. When it comes to Satoru Gojo, this is one of the most interesting questions on the PCLR. Obviously, Gojo isn't immune to feeling remorse, and he definitely does feel guilty on more than one occasion. When meeting back up with Geto after coming back from the verge of death, Gojo flat out says that he's the one that messed up. He didn't feel vengeful when fighting an assassin like Toji, but Gojo realized that it was his responsibility to deal with the assassin like he promised. When becoming an adult, these examples of Gojo feeling remorseful happen way more frequently. He begins to feel guilty again down in Shibuya's B5, and he's very remorseful, but only after a certain level of casualties. Gojo even claims that he's sorry for not being able to save the innocent lives of those trapped underground. Every life lost is something that he's truly sorry that he couldn't prevent. Those lost lives are considered nothing more than a sacrifice to reach the overall goal to save Shibuya City. With more and more casualties, Gojo begins to look more and more visibly distraught at the scene that's currently taking place. He'll avoid ending the lives of civilians with his own hands at all cost, but that doesn't make Gojo any less cold-hearted for his willingness to sacrifice others to achieve his own goal. Before entering Shinjuku and fighting Sukuna, Gojo flat out says that he trained his mind to feel less remorseful. Sukuna's current vessel is Megami Fushiguro. He's Gojo's longest kept student and was raised by him for the last 12 years. Remembering Megami's resemblance to his father Toji meant that Gojo couldn't go all out. He trained his mind to feel a complete lack of remorse about the damage that he's going to be causing to Megami. Obviously, it's an understandable circumstance, and it's the only way to save Megami at the end of the day, but Gojo's behavior still reflects some presence of callousness and lack of empathy. But then again, not really anything extreme. Just to be safe, I'm going to grant Gojo 1 point for question 7. Question number 8, parasitic lifestyle. Does Satoru Gojo find himself exploiting and manipulating others to sustain his own lifestyle? Individuals who score high in this category, they often rely or completely live off of the resources and generosity of others. They'll manipulate others to achieve their own goals instead of actually making genuine efforts independently. Plankton from SpongeBob, being based on an actual sea parasite, is a pretty good example of living under a parasitic lifestyle. Plankton's dream is living off of the recipe and success of the Krusty Krab secret formula. Plankton is an actual sea parasite that's living a parasitic lifestyle, but it's obvious that Gojo doesn't really fall under this category either. He's probably one of, if not the most independent character in the series. Standing alone without the help of others is a central part to why he finds himself trapped in loneliness. Being the leader of his own clan, obviously financially independent, and completely reliant on his own power for the entire series, Gojo definitely doesn't live under a parasitic lifestyle. Gojo gets another 0. Question Question number 9 on the PCLR, lack of realistic long-term goals. Does Satoru Gojo lack realistic long-term goals or demonstrate a failure to plan ahead? Individuals who lack realistic long-term goals are often impulsive, short-sighted, or have a tendency to prioritize immediate gratification over long-term success. They stay more fixated on the now instead of the later. It's not all that important within this current moment, and it's mostly about the present. Satoru Gojo definitely does have his own long-term plans, and to be fair, they're probably more thought out than most other characters in the series. Ongoing corruption within the world isn't really a secret, but especially at the highest level. Those at the top of the political food chain are the problem according to Gojo. Those in charge, they're just some selfish, proud idiots. Within even the highest ranking of political power, you're gonna find the higher-ups. They'll often make biased decisions in the name of keeping their tradition. With some serious change, the higher-ups know that they can easily lose their status at the top, but that's exactly what Gojo plans to achieve. He knows that just walking in and exercising the higher-ups would be a massacre that the people would never approve over. Gojo alone could wipe them out, but the Jujutsu Society would see him as a monster. If the higher-ups were to disappear, the system in place would just have new people with the same agendas to end up taking their place. No real change can be made with a massacre, and that's why Gojo turned to education. He needs strong but intelligent allies too. Gojo will foster them within his students. Following through with this plan, Gojo fights to achieve his dream of resetting the Jujutsu world. Now, for this plan being realistic, it's definitely debatable even by Gojo's standards. I don't think resetting the world politically is impossible. However, the probability of reaching this goal would completely depend on the steps taken to come closer and closer to reaching this achievement. It wouldn't be considered an unrealistic long-term plan if Gojo had taken the necessary steps. Step 1 was clearly assembling those that he can foster into those strong and intelligent allies to lead the modern age. Yuta and Yuji are primary examples that Gojo went out of his way to save to play major roles in achieving his dream. Megumi was considered to be the leader among his students that Gojo raised to lead the modern age. Creating his own team of those with potential even greater than the current standard for special grade was definitely the right first step to reaching his vision. However, as their teacher, it's unrealistic to believe that Gojo was fit to raise the modern age of sorcerers. Gojo is and has been the strongest. It's harder for somebody who's always been able to achieve everything from the start to teach others the steps to reaching that same achievement. Since Gojo never really required learning the steps to reach greatness, he doesn't even know where to start. Doing something as simple as a simple domain should have been one of the first techniques that Gojo taught his students. Or at bare minimum, at least eventually he should have taught this to one of his students. Considering Maki couldn't use cursed energy and Megumi later found out that he could cast his own domain expansion, I'm more so focusing on Yuji and others who really didn't have their own domain expansion, or in Yuji's case more specifically, he didn't even have a curse technique. Yuki Tsukuma went out of her way to teach Todo simple domain, so what's really the excuse? Yuji basically asked this same question to Kusakabe after seeing Gojo pop one of his own simple domains inside Malevolent Shrine. Kusakabe explains that Gojo being a prodigy, it holds him back from being a great teacher. It's harder for someone who's never been weak. Obviously, he's not completely useless as their teacher, and Gojo's capable of helping his students where he can. When it came to quickly learning the basics of cursed energy manipulation, Yuta and Yuji seemed to grow quickly. However, both Yuta and Yuji, they never really properly mastered their cursed energy with Gojo's help. It definitely took their own personal experience. Yuta had to learn to control his emotions during his fight with Suguru Geto. Yuji's cursed energy lagged due to never being taught how to flow cursed energy properly, creating Divergent Fist. They both also never fully mastered imbuing weapons with cursed energy just from Gojo's training alone. Yuta cracked his sword when fighting Geto, and Yuji flat out says that he never got an opportunity to learn this with Gojo. It's probably harder to explain and teach from what you understand about cursed energy when your efficiency and skill with manipulating cursed energy has been greatly boosted with the Six Eyes. But that's just one example where the advanced stages of Gojo's training ended up falling short with his students. Being able to connect with your students is a crucial aspect to being a teacher, and it's another area that Gojo falls short. He felt isolated. There's something between himself and everybody else around. Gojo goes out of his way to mention that this applies to everyone, even those who love and adored him. That last line was obviously referring to his students, which explains the blooming flower on screen. It represents his dream of fostering them into strong allies. Understanding that there's a gap between himself and others around him is problematic for becoming a teacher. Connecting with them and having the ability to relate overall with your students is crucial for manifesting that bond that's going to be needed to create that long-term influence that's going to be imprinted onto your students. The last thing that any teacher would want is for their student to be leaving the classroom thinking that their teacher is an idiot because of their inability to share their understanding. However, at the end of the day, the higher-ups were still wiped out by Satoru Gojo, and it went against his previous decision to avoid creating a massacre. The only real difference now is that after the massacre, Gojo can have Gakuganji take control instead of having other people who also share the same agenda as the higher-ups going on to take their place, like Gojo was worried about in the beginning of the series. Now, going forward from this point on, if Gojo goes on to lose against Sukuna, chaos like what happened after Shibuya would never happen again because Gakuganji would be the one in charge. But even with Gakuganji's takeover over solving for some aspects that were problematic before, the problem from within the Jujutsu society after a massacre would still remain. The people in the community overall would never remain complicit and approve of having their leading political officials getting massacred. Gojo goes on to request that Yuta, Inumaki, Panda, and Maki go on to leave before he gets started. Aside from his future actions being very gruesome, Gojo doesn't really know if this decision is, quote, the right thing to do. Taking part in something this gruesome could potentially paint Gojo's group as evil individuals instead of leaders, which would go on to endanger his entire goal. Now, when considering everything mentioned so far, Gojo does definitely lack realistic long-term goals and demonstrates a failure to plan ahead. Satoru Gojo is going to receive 2 points for this question. Question number 10 on the PCLR. Does Satoru Gojo exhibit having poor behavior controls? Individuals who score highly within this category, they often struggle to control their behavior and emotions, and often react impulsively or aggressively without considering the consequences. Surprisingly, when taking Gojo into consideration, he probably doesn't score any points within this section. In fact, he's probably better than most people when it comes to controlling their emotions. Cursed energy itself is just negative energy that's powered by negative emotion, and controlling those emotions is crucial in becoming a strong sorcerer. Controlling some of the strongest emotions like pain, regret, and anger are the first steps to manipulating cursed energy. You could try making the argument that because his 6 eyes help him control his cursed energy, it's not really Gojo controlling his own emotions, but we know for a fact that Gojo has to control his own emotions himself and not with his 6 eyes. This statement comes from Gojo explaining to Yuji how exactly to become strong after Yuji asked how to become the strongest himself while thinking back to Gojo's own words. He clearly demonstrates an understanding for the importance in controlling your emotions, and it's why he trains his mind before his fight with Sukuna. During his younger years, it might have been a little bit more debatable, but as an adult, Satoru Gojo can more than confidently control his emotions and behavior. I'm gonna grade Gojo with a 0 for this category. Moving on to question number 12 on the PCLR, did Satoru Gojo exhibit behavior problems during his childhood or adolescence? High scores on this trait often correlate with a history of persistent and serious childhood or adolescent behavior problems. We didn't spend much time seeing his childhood, but I feel like we definitely saw enough of younger Gojo to answer this question. For example, when Yudahime and Meimei were trapped inside a barrier by a cursed spirit that they've been tracking down, they've been traveling in circles for quite a bit of time. However, before trying to escape on their own, the ceiling begins to crack open. Gojo had used his limitless curse technique to activate blue to completely rip apart the building with Yudahime and Meimei still inside. Aside from this being incredibly irresponsible and potentially endangering Yudahime and Meimei, Gojo had forgotten to place down his curtain before using a large-scale attack with Jujutsu. Considering Gojo then immediately goes on to explain why he doesn't feel responsible for not doing things like placing down curtains to protect non-sorcerers, I highly doubt that Gojo is a first-time offender. Being generous, since we don't see Gojo that much during his younger years, he's gonna receive just 1 point. Question number 13. Does Satoru Gojo often engage in spontaneous and hasty behavior without having an adequate forethought or consideration for the potential risks and consequences? Individuals who are placed under this section on the PCLR, they often find that their actions are poorly planned, reckless, or taken on a whim. These individuals often find themselves in trouble because they seek immediate gratification, but without taking into account the potential risks and acting frequently on impulse. I really find it hard to say that this is the place that we should categorize Gojo. Sometimes it can seem like some of these decisions are made impulsively without Gojo spending much time thinking about the future outcome by making each of these decisions. However, that's partially because in reality, Gojo doesn't spend much time planning for each of these actions. But then again, that's not for any reason that would make him seem psychopathic. Using the 6 eyes, it grants him high-speed processing. Gojo's mind just moves much faster than any other sorcerer. Thoughts that can normally take minutes to fully process can happen instantly for Satoru Gojo. Decisions like casting his point 2 Infinite Void down in Shibuya's B5 was a very well thought out decision, and probably the most well calculated that we've ever seen Satoru Gojo. Some parts of this plan come down to intuition, but most of this plan was strategically formulated by Gojo's own estimations. Other decisions like keeping around Yuji and Yuta were also actions that were created with much forethought in mind, and even during battle, while some of his reactions might have been made out of impulse, we saw Gojo thoroughly change up his strategy right in the middle of the fight. Striking Sukuna in the back with a red that was designed to travel around the building, or even Gojo setting up an unlimited hollow purple is a very well planned strategy that was definitely not designed out of impulse. Satoru Gojo clearly does not act impulsively. I'm giving him 0 points for this section. Question number 14 on the PCLR. Does Satoru Gojo fail to acknowledge responsibility for his own actions? Individuals who find themselves placed within this category, they often avoid accepting responsibility, but for actions that were typically led with a bad outcome. Gojo doesn't really find himself placed in this category whatsoever. He definitely made his own fair share of apologies and understands clearly when he's the one that messed up. When speaking with Suguru Geto in the afterlife, he fully accepts losing to Sukuna. Gojo even goes as far to mention that even without the 10 shadows, nothing would have changed the outcome of this fight. Whether that's actually true or not isn't really the topic of discussion. It clearly shows on many levels that Gojo is willing to accept responsibility even for actions that have led to bad outcomes. Satoru Gojo is going to be scored with another 0. In total, he's received about 7 points throughout this examination. The original PCLR is compacted with a total of 20 questions. However, our version is only 14. The removed questions aren't here because they obviously weren't going to impact the overall score, or they just don't at all pertain to Gojo or aren't applicable to the world of JJK. Here on screen, you can see just some of the ridiculous ones, but this also means that with some missing questions, we're going to need to adjust the overall score to be considered a psychopath. It depends really on what institution you're looking at, but their scores for diagnosing psychopathy are really mostly between 25 and about 30 points. Considering that score reflects the rating of a 20-point question exam, we're going to need to adjust our grading system for our 14-question version of the PCLR. In order to consider Satoru Gojo a potential psychopath on our version of the psychopathy checklist, we'd need him to score at least 12.5 points. With just a total of 7 points, according to the PCLR examination that's used both clinically and across the criminal justice system, Satoru Gojo would not be considered a psychopath. So here's my final opinion. With his younger years, it's definitely more debatable if he temporarily enters a state of mind that could come with its own psychopathic traits. However, temporarily entering a state of mind with psychopathic tendencies doesn't really make you a psychopath. He very well might have entered a state of mind where he would have had psychopathic traits, but there's a pretty big difference between a state of mind and the trait of a person's character. It's pretty unfair to diagnose Gojo's character overall as one of Jujutsu Kaisen's psychopaths. I mean, not being diagnosed as a psychopath doesn't mean he completely checks out psychologically. Antisocial personality disorder is definitely debatable, but that's a topic for another video. Big thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and make sure you guys check out the link in the description so that way you don't miss out on this great deal.